there are over 100 Green parties around the country, or around the country. Oh, it's getting to the end of the night. There's over 100 Green parties around the world in various countries, not just in the U.S., but and not just in Europe either. Across South America, across Asia, across Africa, and of course in Australia. There's Green parties on every continent. I guess the scientists in Antarctica probably have a Green Party. We'll just call it that. every continent. But anyway, there's a lot of Green parties. And I think that's very important because any sort of eco-socialist movement, by its necessity, dealing with global capitalism, it means it needs to be an international eco-socialist movement. We have to build this international movement. And there's a basic framework, at least here, right? Because there's Green parties around the world. It's a little bit more complex than that because some of these Green parties have varying stances on things, even though in theory we're all united by a few key values, but we interpret them a little bit differently. For example, some of the European Green parties, you'll notice, lean a little bit more into liberalism. They sound a little bit more like the Democratic Party, or our Democratic Party in the U.S., whereas the U.S. and some other countries are much more openly eco-socialist. So they're not all the same, and we definitely have tensions with each other sometimes. So, I'm not saying it's perfect or whatever, but I do think it's good, at least, that this is the direction that things are moving in, that there's a growing number of Green parties around the world, and I think those Green parties are, many of them are radicalizing more, right? They're shifting more toward an eco-socialist stance than they used to have in the past. So that's very important, I think, to grow the international eco-socialist movement necessary to really take on capitalism. Because, just like we have our 4 pillars, because, ecology, social justice, peace, democracy, they're all intertwined. They're all intersectional. You have to deal with them all together. I think it's very similar in terms of the international movement, that capitalism is not restricted to the U.S., right? It's all around the world. We have to have an international movement, international working class solidarity through some kind of movement and structure. And so, whereas some smaller groups in the U.S. are restricted to just the U.S., they're just a small group here. I think it is cool, at least, that there are Green parties around the world that we can reach out to and that we actually do talk to. And that, we have representatives that go visit them. One of the other steering committee co-chairs actually recently went to Brazil to cover their elections, and he went and talked to leftist parties and Green parties and all in Brazil and other countries. And if you follow the National Party's social media, you can find some video clips with him interviewing people. But
like we said, at the beginning, when we were talking about, the Green Party of the United States is a socialist party. That's been something that, as we said, there's been socialists from the beginning. Our interpretation of that is that, fundamentally it's always been a socialist party, but it's been an evolution as a party. And the same kind of evolution, the same kind of political struggles are happening around the world. Garrett mentioned the German Greens, and they kind of are the bellwether, right? They're the well-known ones. They had power. They actually came into power in decades past. And they tend to represent that more liberal flank of the International Green Party. In fact, the Green Party of the United States and the German Greens don't tend to get along very well in when it comes to our existence. But so you have kind of the German Greens and like the Green Party of England and Wales that kind of make up that more liberal politics in Europe. But also in Europe, you're seeing the rise of an eco-socialist faction, which is generally called the Nordic bloc. It includes countries like Amsterdam, or like the Netherlands. Like I said, Amsterdam has a Green City Council. It includes Denmark, where the Green Party are in the farthest left coalition in their parliament, and it's called the Green Red Alliance, and they're in a coalition with other parties, including the Revolutionary Communist Party. And then the big one is Iceland, right? I haven't seen it much lately, but a few years ago, you heard a lot about the woman that was the prime minister of Iceland and all the amazing things that she was doing. What they didn't tell you in Western media and U.S. media was that she was a Green.
Mhm.
right? The Green Party was running, when they were, going at bankers and things, that was the Greens
Yep.
that were in power then. And so we're seeing the rise of this Nordic bloc that's really challenging, and they're rising, right? They're being elected, having prime ministers elected. They're having having control of major metropolitan city councils, whereas the more liberal green parties like Germany are seeing their power fall. Another good example of left socialist greens would be Australia and New Zealand, and they have much further left parties than and at least Australia. That's kind of a new shift that they made, and that shift combined with deep canvassing, which we talk a lot about in our organizing, saw them increase the number of representatives they had in their parliament by about 3 times in the most recent.
One important lesson that we learned from them, I forget if it was 2016 or 2018 or something, but the Australian Green Party switched to becoming a dues-paying membership party, and that got them so many more members and so much more funding that they were able to organize over a few years to get the wins that they've had recently. So that's again, one of our Green Party allies showing us kind of the way forward for the U.S.
Yeah, and that focus on deep canvassing, which we don't have time to get into, but it made all the difference, right? Long-term conversations in your community it builds those relationships that can bring you to wins, as opposed to I'm getting into it, even though I said I wouldn't, but as opposed to the traditional door knock canvassing that you see in electoral campaigns in the U.S., which research shows don't actually influence voters. Those one-off conversations where they tell you why you should vote for their candidate doesn't actually change people's minds. What changes people's minds is long-term conversations, long-term engagement, and building those relationships. We're seeing, and it shouldn't be surprising that we're seeing the socialist-oriented, green parties pick up those organizing tactics. And start to see some real change. So
it's there's growing, especially in Europe, but I think it's even true in South America. It's a red-green alliance, right? That Greens are partnering with the socialist and labor parties, or in those countries, and those coalitions are what's winning.
Yeah. The U.S. Our first past the post system also creates a dynamic that isn't existent in a lot of the rest. It isn't in existence in a lot of the rest of the world.